Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Harvard Divinity School to this panel discussion on the Papacy and the modern Catholic Church. My name is Kevin Madigan. I teach the history of Christianity here, and my friend Paul Massari asked me to begin with roughly 10 minutes of reflections on the Papacy and the Church in the past 10 years. As it turns out, I am a medievalist, and I could probably say more about the first 10 years of the 13th century and the papacy than the past 10 years, but nonetheless, I will accept Paul's charge. After that, I will introduce our three panel participants. Now, acknowledging what he called his, quote, incapacity adequately to fulfill the ministry entrusted to me, Benedict XVI announced that he would step down effective 8 p.m. Rome time, February 28, 2013. He had, as you all know, served as Pope since 2005. His successor, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, a sometime Archbishop of Buenos Aires, was elected within 2 weeks. He took the name Francis to honor the 13th century Saint Francis of Assisi. He is the first Jesuit Pope, the first Pope from the Americas, and the first Pope from the Southern Hemisphere. That much is clear. What we do not know is how he will be measured against the achievements of his predecessor and also against the achievements of the changes of Vatican II, which have become a matter of very significant controversy during the pontificates, not only of Benedict XVI, but of his predecessor, John Paul II. So let me begin by giving 10 very, very short theses or reflections on the past 10 years or so, most of them having to do with Benedict's pontificate as a way of looking forward to Francis's pontificate, a topic which our three panelists will then take on. One, first of all, Benedict, I think, will go down in history as among the most distinguished Catholic theologians in the papacy in this century. Excuse me. Not surprisingly, he will go down in history as a teaching pope rather than as an administrator or as a governor, I think. His zeal was usually stirred up by his speeches, his books, and his teaching documents. It will be these for which he would want to have been remembered, I think. Though whether historical memory will honor his wishes remains to be seen. Okay? This is because, too, his papacy was filled with crises. The first occurred on the occasion of a speech given in Regensburg. In that speech, as you'll all recall, he quoted a Byzantine emperor who linked the prophet Muhammad with violence. That speech touched off actual physical and social violence as churches in the West Bank and Gaza were firebombed and an Italian nun shot to death in Somalia. Here one would want properly to understand this speech in relation to Nostra Aetate, the famous declaration on the relation of the Church to non-Christian religions promulgated in 1965 by the Second Vatican Council. Third, by the time Benedict took office, and again, along the line of crises, the massive sexual abuse scandals had already shocked the American church. A second wave of revelations, these mostly having to do with European churches and bishops, engulfed Europe 5 years into Benedict's papacy. This time, Benedict himself was drawn into the vortex of charges, as he appeared to have let at least one pedophile priest go unpunished. Benedict was consistently charged with not holding bishops liable for their inactivity. Fourth, Benedict also drew attention and criticism for his 2007 decision to renew the Old Latin Mass, the Old Latin Rite. This, as is well known, included a controversial Good Friday prayer for the conversion of the perfidious Jews. Fifth, Benedict also lifted the excommunications of 4 rogue or ultra-traditional bishops in 2009. One of these, Bernard Williamson's, denied that the Nazis had ever used gas chambers and claimed that the historical evidence is hugely against, that's a quote, hugely against Adolf Hitler being responsible for the death of 6 million Jews. Number 6, While aboard a plane to Africa, Benedict asserted that the use of condoms made the AIDS epidemic worse. Comments made by Benedict aboard the papal plane to Africa in 2009 suggested that far from protecting people, that birth control, such as I just mentioned, actually worsened the AIDS epidemic, and so drew a censure, the first that I know of a pope from the parliament of a European nation, namely Belgium, while the Spanish government airlifted 1 million condoms to Africa in protest. Number 7, the 7th of my short points. Benedict in 2009 issued a decree that moved Pius XII, the controversial wartime pope, to make him venerable, and thus to move him one step closer to sainthood, despite massive blowback from Catholics and Jews alike that he was all too passive at the moment of truth in World War II, when the trains were moving eastward to the charnel houses of Auschwitz and so forth. The 8th of my points. Toward the end of Benedict's papacy, there were revelations of bureaucratic dysfunction and backbiting and even money laundering charges leveled at the Vatican Bank. And this is not even to mention the VatiLeaks scandal, which portrayed the Vatican as a hothouse of intrigue and factionalism, and other matters best not mentioned in public. Number 8, unlike his predecessor, Benedict largely absented himself from the geopolitical scene. His aim, I think, was rather to strengthen Catholic identity in what seemed to him a highly secular age, at least in the West. In that sense, he sustained the more evangelical emphasis established by his predecessors. 9, when he did flex his disciplinary muscle, it was not, as with his predecessor for the use of, for example, of Marxism in liberation theology, but against what he called an ideology of gender. These included, his denunciations included priests and even excommunications of priests and nuns who called for women's ordination. And finally, of the points that I have to make, Benedict was also interestingly capable of irritating those whom we would put on the right. Okay, what with his strong critique of global capitalism and his comments on care for the earth, for which some have dubbed him with perhaps some enthusiasm, the Green Pope. Okay? So those are some things that I see in Benedict's pontificate. Let me turn then to introduce our distinguished guests. First of all, it's a pleasure to introduce a man who needs no introduction at HDS and is, in addition, an honored personal friend. A columnist for the Boston Globe, James Carroll, in the middle here, is author of 10 novels and 7 works of fiction, including Jerusalem, Jerusalem, most recently. Many of you know him for the columns that he writes in the Boston Globe, for which in 2012 he received the Scripps Howard National Journalism Award for commentary. Carroll's moving memoir, An American Requiem, God, My Father, and the War That Came Between Us, received the 1996 National Book Award in nonfiction and other awards as well. His book, Constantine's Sword, The Church and the Jews, much of which was researched here at Harvard, was published in 2001, was a New York Times bestseller, and was honored as one of the best books of 2001 by many newspapers. It was named a notable book of the year by the New York Times and won numerous prizes. I want to observe that the last part of Jim's book, Constantine's Sword, was a constructive rather than historical piece, and a call for an agenda of reform that we might want to revisit this evening. Secondly, also an honored friend, but one whom I see every day, Francis Clooney is Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology, and since 2010, Director of the Center for the Study of World Religions. After earning his doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations, he taught at BC for 21 years until coming to Harvard. His primary areas of scholarship are theological commentarial writings in the Sanskrit and Tamil traditions of Hindu India and the developing field of comparative theology. Frank has also written on the Jesuit missionary tradition, particularly in India, and the dynamics of dialogue in the contemporary world. Professor Clooney is also the author of numerous articles and books, including Beyond Compare, St. Francis de Sales, and Sri Vedante Desika on loving surrender to God. And finally, a new friend, but known to all of you. We're very fortunate to have with us tonight the journalist and broadcaster Christopher Lydon to moderate tonight's discussion. Christopher, as many of you will know, is the host of Radio Open Source, a conversation on arts, ideas, and politics from Brown University's Watson Institute. Blogger Dave Weiner calls Chris Lydon the original podcaster. Christopher, for many years, covered city and state politics for the Boston Globe and many presidential campaigns from McGoverns through Humphreys, Reagans, Carters, and so forth. And for the New York Times, he also anchored the 10 o'clock news at WGBH TV in Boston and founded The Connection on public radio with producer Mary McGrath. Chris, it's great to have you at HDS, and we're delighted to have all three of our panelists here tonight. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Chris to moderate our discussion. Chris, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. As Kevin said, I'm the mere moderator here. I'm not a theologian. But I met the primary qualification to be a white, Irish, Catholic, Christian guy, which was the essential screen for the panel. We're a little embarrassed about this, and there will be a sort of affirmative action for non-English speaking, female, Buddhists, or everything else when we come to the questions. I can see that this is an extraordinarily learned, activist, articulate audience, and so we're going to make a point of trying to enlist you early and often in this conversation. It's an amazing moment where even the Catholic Church sort of must be rebranded, reconsidered, reevaluated. I mean, that's the other wonderful irony, that the Catholic Church nowadays has to come for a grade and a kind of evaluation at the Harvard Divinity School. But that's what we're about, and it's a wide open conversation. As Kevin has suggested, there are innumerable angles to this elevation of a third world Jesuit with an Italian name. And I keep thinking, in a world in which we halfway know that nothing big can survive anymore. Everything is up for grabs, and so we want to test all the premises that we can today. I thought I'd simply begin by asking Father Clooney and Jim to suggest an agenda for the church, but an agenda for our conversation this afternoon. Would you begin,
Sure.
Frank?
Okay. And I would just like to stress what Chris just said. We're happy to be up here and do our part, but we're very much looking forward to the conversation because we realize there are many different voices in this room, so we hope that we have a genuinely true exchange. I mean, I think the way to talk about the future is to talk about where we are, and let me just make a few points, and then we can, I'll turn things over to Jim. And echoing what Kevin said, I think one of the very important things about the papacy of Benedict, and this has been pointed out many times, is that he resigned. And the point of the resignation was to demythologize the papacy, I would say. That the very close and almost inseparable sense of the person, the office, and Christ no longer needed to be seen that way. And that while there are many, many different things that one might argue with Benedict and he would want to argue back about, the fact that he was able to separate this out and say, if you can't do the job, then step down, sets a wonderful model for a hierarchical church. If you can't do the job you're in, get out of it. And I think that sets its tone. My expectation would be that our new Pope, Francis, also at some point will resign because he'll realize I'm no longer able to do the job. The second thing, and this is an obvious thing, is that it's a sign of the future and where things going, is that he's not a European. Now you can argue that he's a bridge candidate because he's of Italian heritage in Argentina, which is in some ways, I've been told, I've never been there, a country with a strong kind of European set of links and so on. But nonetheless, where the bulk of the world's Catholics live and getting out of the European context, and we might imagine that the next Pope will be an African, the next Pope will be an Asian, and that this will start a rotation among this much larger church. And I think that's an exciting possibility that this opens the door to. Reading some of the things that Francis has written, it's clear also that he is looking for a church that is engaged in the world in which we actually live. So as much has been said about Francis of Assisi, the poor, humility, and the like. But I think for Francis, as far as I can tell, it's not a romanticism of personal piety, but it's a recognition that if the church is to have any relevance or any meaning, or if preaching the gospel is to mean anything, then it has to be engaged in the real world in which we live. The doors have to be open. The church has to stop looking inward and start looking outward. People have to get out of their clerical ghettos. They have to be engaged in the world around us. And I think that's exciting. And if Francis is able to carry off that agenda, then I think that sets a good tone about where will it lead. Sometimes we don't know where things lead when you step out of your safe area. And I think that's exciting. And the two final points. I mean, one, I would say the fact that he's a Jesuit. I mean, I think that's a wonderful thing to have a Jesuit Pope. That is, Francis and not Francis Xavier was a real loss, but nonetheless, what can I say about that? I think, how does this matter? And we can talk about this. I'm sure others will have insights. One aspect is that he's lived, most of his life, maybe not as cardinal, but in community. And that he's lived in community. He's had to rub shoulders with all kinds of Jesuits, which any Jesuit will know can be a great sacrifice, living with other Jesuits. The idea that you're not in control of your individual privacy, but you're always mixing it up in community. You have superiors, you are a superior, you're back in the ranks, and you're mixing it up. And 50 years of that, I think, will serve him well. The second thing I think about his being a Jesuit is that he didn't come into the Society of Jesus intending to become Monsignor, a bishop, a cardinal, a pope, but that the very pragmatic notion of Jesuits is to open it up and do the mission, follow the work, and that it's not really seen in the Jesuit tradition, normally speaking, there are many exceptions, of wanting to become that kind of hierarchical leader. And the fact that he didn't go into this for that reason, I think, is an exciting point. And then mission, obviously mission, anybody elected pope would have a strong sense of evangelization or mission. But I'd like to think, and we can talk about this, that the Jesuit charism of mission is to be in the borderlands, to be at the edge between the church and the world outside the church, to be where the comforts of talking to fellow Catholics or a kind of an intra-Christian language gives way to not being afraid of people who are not Christian or people who are secular or places where there's moral ambiguity. And that it seems that while no one elected pope will have predictable record of this sort or that sort, Francis has been able to test the waters and cross those boundaries in some of the situations he's been in. And the final thing I would say, and turn it over to Jim, is that what do we expect from anybody as a pope in the next 10 years? I mean, as Kevin mentioned, I'm director of the Center for the Study of World Religions. We have a staff of 5 people. We have 20 people living there, and I can barely manage it from day to day. If you have 1.2 billion Catholics in the world, it is absurd to think that anybody sitting there in Rome can be the leader who will get the flock back in shape. And I think on the one hand, Francis set a good tone at the start saying, when he came out on the balcony, I'm here as the Bishop of Rome. This is my diocese. As Bishop of Rome, I have a certain standing in the Universal Church, but I am not the Universal Church. And I think that's important. On the other side of it, I think I would tap into a Catholic sacramental consciousness, that it's not so much that the Pope can be everything or everywhere or have this kind of universality, but the fact of this figure in Rome is like other sacraments. It's a little thing and a big thing. And by appreciating how little it is, one can allow it to have a larger role. But anyone who would be expecting the Pope to move the clock forward or turn the clock back or whatever will likely be disappointed. But for the man in that position temporarily until, I hope in 5 years or so, he resigns, nonetheless there'll be this sense of a sacramental presence that makes certain things possible in the real world in which we live. So those are my expectations as we start.
Thank you. Jim Carroll.
My deep privilege to be here with you, acknowledge my debt to the Divinity School, where I've done, such as it is, my best work. I don't like to think of it as behind me, but I'm very grateful to be at the Divinity School with Frank. whom I long admire, and my old and dear friend Chris. And I'll just quickly say a couple of things. I can't actually think about this moment as a Catholic without casting back to the moment it so deeply reminds me of, which was the election of Pope John the 23rd. And the lesson of the election of Pope John the 23rd that's relevant for the next 10 years of this papacy is, however wonderful Roncalli was, and he was wonderful, a deeply humane person, unusual to be elected Pope, is more or less the same age as Pope Francis upon his election. However wonderful he was, the most important thing that led to the revolutionary changes of the Second Vatican Council came from outside the church. It was the world forcing itself upon the church. And I remember the movement from the church against the world, which is really defining the world, the church into which I was born, which became the church and the world, a kind of truce, to the way the Second Vatican Council, in a revolutionary title, defined itself, the church in the world. And there is no more the church and the world, and there's no more pretense that the world and the church are apart. And it was because the world imposed itself on the church in those years. Roncalli elected in 58, the Vatican Council from 62 to 65, and 4 monumental revolutionary acts, Lumen Gentium, Dignitatis Humanae, Nostra Aetate, and Pacem in Terris, revolutions in what the church thought about itself. No more, no salvation outside the church. No more even defining the Catholic Church as the church. Dignitatis Humanae, the elevation of conscience as the fundamental standard against which every person must be measured and measured herself or himself. Freedom of conscience, belonging within the church as well as outside the church, opening Catholicism to pluralism and to diversity of practice and belief in the church. Nostra Aetate, of course. People wonder if the church can really change in anything fundamental. Ordination of women, ordination of married. None of that compares to the change instituted by Nostra Aetate. A profound flip in the single most solemn proclamation of Christianity, I would argue, which is that the church has superseded the synagogue and that the Jewish people are no longer the chosen people of God. A repudiation of not just the Christ killer myth, but a repudiation of supersessionist theology, which has its roots in the New Testament itself. If that can change, what can't change? That's Nostra Aetate. And finally, Pacem in Terris, which turned the Church of the Just War into a peace church. All of these came about in response to World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, and Hiroshima. The Holocaust, overwhelmingly, a direct experience of most of the bishops of the Vatican Council, especially the Europeans, especially John the 23rd himself. And Hiroshima, remembering that the Second Vatican Council, by an act of the Holy Spirit, one might say, convened the week of the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the bishops of the council had to adjourn, as the whole world did, to watch to see whether we were going to go up in flames, the planet itself. And by the time that adjournment was over, the council was different, having been at the mercy of Ottaviani and the conservative curia at the very beginning of the council, for example, voting to not translate the Latin into other languages, having Ottaviani put before them a prepared document on the liturgy of the church, which the bishops were clearly prepared to accept. By the time they reconvened, understanding something new about what was at stake, the survival of the species, they overwhelmingly threw out Ottaviani's proposals, and John the 23rd turned to someone next to him in his apartment and said, "Now my council begins." The point being, it was the world to which the bishops were responding. And Francis has to respond to the world. And the world is rife for change. And if the movement for liberal democracy can ignite fires in the hearts of young people all over the globe, the Roman Catholic Church is not going to be exempt from that. if women all over the planet are insisting upon their right to be equal partners in the creation of the future, the Catholic Church is not going to stand against that. And the way in which the world itself now is a small neighborhood with people having to live together, respecting the differences as what makes us a magnificent species, the Catholic Church isn't going to stand against that either. So the only question is whether the opportunities will be seized and responded to. And in that, we do have to pay tribute to the charism and courage of John the 23rd. A different man at that moment might have led to a different outcome. But he wasn't the initiator, he was the enabler and the responder. And I'm hopeful that Pope Francis will play his version of an equivalent role going forward, because history requires it.
Jim, thank you. That was fantastic. I want to open this up sooner rather than later to questions, but I'd just like to ask, this is a slightly presumptuous, big question, but we read so much in the coverage of the transition about the demographics of the church and the size of the church and the distribution of the church, blah, blah, blah. Would you just, starting with you, Frank, give us a kind of wild weather satellite overview of the moral condition of the church and where it thrives, where it's not thriving. I mean, a kind of an anatomical review of what you see out there, what the growth in Africa and elsewhere actually means about this mystical body.
Somewhat like Kevin in the introduction, I'd be more comfortable to tell you about the number of Catholics in South India in the early 17th century. But that's probably not what you're asking. I mean, my sense is, what does it mean the church is flourishing or decaying? And I think we've learned over and over again, and Jim has been one of those who's taught us, that when the church becomes overly successful, overly institutionalized, always bonded with a certain power structure, it begins to decay. So I would think the places in the world, such as parts of Europe, parts of North America, certain countries in Latin America, where the church became one with the establishment and became cozy with the establishment, are the places where that establishment is deeply in trouble. And so some of the alienation in parts of Europe that we read about, parts of the disillusionment in Boston, or I gather in certain parts of Latin America, are signs that the old structures are no longer working. But I would also think that where is the church growing? Partly it's in places where it was never established in that fashion. So the country I'm most familiar with in Asia is India. And while certainly there are hierarchical structures in the Indian church, and vast clerical structures included, there is this very lively, very small church in a very large Hindu-Muslim culture. And it can be difficult sometimes to be in the minority. It can sometimes be exciting to be. And I would guess, I have no expertise on Africa, and I defer to others here, that where the church is struggling to define itself in a post-colonial age, in newly independent or 50-year independent countries now, there is a certain excitement about having to reinvent what religion and society mean, or religion and politics mean. I gather, again, I defer to others, in the Latin American context, if you have the hierarchical coziness with power structures in certain parts of Latin America, you also have this vast population of people who've been living out experimentally what it means to be Catholic in what actually is pluralistic culture, even though sometimes it's just layered as Catholic. So I think you probably could say that, what I said, I mean, just everywhere in the world where it's been too cozy with power, it's in trouble and has been abused and abusing that power. But wherever people had been vulnerable to this openness, the crossing of the borders, not having the power to control things, the church is exciting and growing. But in fact, as we all know, most of the Catholics in the world are south of the equator. And places like Latin America and India, the Philippines and so on are quite exciting new places for Christianity.
Can you pinpoint the issues that it's growing around? I mean, problems in the society, aspirations in the church. I mean, what are the what are we selling today, so to speak? And what's moving? What are the growth stocks in?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to generalize.
Awful question,
such a
sorry.
Scale, but I think, I mean, I would say one of the great characteristic issues in global Christianity, particularly, let's say, outside of Western Europe, North America, is what does it mean to be an Asian Christian? What does it mean to be an Indian Christian? What does it mean to be a Nigerian Christian? When the cultural boundaries have been redefined, I mean, how do you become a member, a continuing member of your community, a continuing member of your nation with its many different cultural, linguistic, religious traditions? How do you sort this out in a way that, on the one hand, you can say, I'm recognizably Roman Catholic, there's a fidelity to Christ and to the tradition of the church, but I'm not a Nigerian, I'm not an Indian, I'm not Japanese. How does one find ways to cross the cultural, linguistic, religious boundaries and make the church take root in these different cultures in a very vibrant way? That will overflow into all the issues of religion and politics, religion and economics, religion and human rights, the rights of women, education in various parts of the world. What's the role of a Catholic in a very large, diverse cultures? Has to be reinvented in the countries where there aren't these kind of routinized imperial or colonialist structures already in place. That's what I would say.
Jim,
I think for me, the issue is, and I think there's a way in which this does define something of the Christian revolution in our time, which is trying to recover a God-centered faith as opposed to a Christ-centered faith, and in a way just in time. I mean, remembering that Jesus pointed to the one whom he called Father. He didn't point to himself. And it's a development in early Christianity, I know, when Jesus becomes acclaimed and then when Jesus becomes worshipped. But nevertheless, to recover that sense that it's God that we're grappling with here. And the reason that matters to us, of course, and in that context, every culture has something to tell us. And every human person has something to tell us. And even the repudiation of God has something important to tell us. So that atheism itself, or more broadly, secularism itself, can be such a revelation to a people who have at the center of their lives the question, who is God for us? And that's the question that's the question to which Jesus spoke, as I remember him, and I think that's the question to which the community of the church has always attempted to speak. Who is God for us? And we're living in a time when the language about God is, as everyone in this room knows, problematic. As Charles Taylor put it in his book, in 1500, it was unthinkable that one not be a believer in God. And in the year 2000, certainly in the West, it's almost unthinkable that one would be a believer in God. Which, of course, puts the question, well, who is God anyway? And that, to me, is the great opportunity. And we're so accustomed to denominationally defining our Christianity. We Catholics have a long way to go on that, to begin to de-emphasize the denominational and understand ourselves more with all of Christianity, because all of Christianity is having this problem. And to the extent that we defend ourselves against the God question, we're going to shrivel and die, because the faith begins with the God question. And in that context, atheism is not a threat to us. It's an opportunity to engage a conversation that will open up the meaning of our faith in a fresh way. So you're all going to think I'm just this throwback, because I begin with Vatican II, and now I'm talking, of course, about the Harvey Cox secular city revolution, which is alive and well here because of Harvey's presence to it, but it's the conversation the church has yet to finish. And I think that's engaged, whether you're talking about the Virgin of Guadalupe and the pieties attached to her in Latin America, or whether you're talking about other indigenous pieties associated with other ways Christians are believing in Asia or Africa. We're all looking for the language to put on the one for whom there is no language, finally. And that's what makes this tradition so valuable, because the richness, especially of our Catholic angle on it, of course, is the glorification of symbol and sacrament, and the nonverbal, and the gesture, and the costume. Let's face it, we love the Pope because of the costume, and we want him to simplify, but please, not all the way, right? I mean, there is that way in which the nonverbal is essential because it engages the imagination, which requires engagement of the whole person.
Can I just give an example of that?
Please.
I was thinking, I mean, in terms of how does this work effectively, because I think obviously Francis, as a Christian, as a member of the Society of Jesus, is Jesus-centered. So it's a Jesus-centered view of reality. But that can become a clerical preserve or protective interned attitude that's afraid of the world in which we live. So what was the most dramatic thing that Francis has done so far? Arguably on Holy Thursday, mindful of the very rich tradition of Christian churches on Holy Thursday and the earlier indispensable traditions of Passover and the Jewish people, he doesn't stay at John Lateran, he doesn't stay at St. Peter's, but goes to the prison, goes outside the enclave, goes outside the safe preserves of the Catholic world, and washes the feet of the men and women who are imprisoned there at the moment, without regard for gender, without regard for are they Christian or not. And somehow that's, again, sacramental presence. He would say this is what Jesus would do. So it's about Jesus still, but it's a new imagination about where Jesus would be. And I think this idea of going out there and not hiding inside the Vatican is a symbol of that.
Could I just say, Jim Carroll and I are friends from way back, and we had the great privilege of being in a small group that read the Bible, you know, page 1 to page whatever it was, and then decided to do it again. So we've been through some of these. I'm amazed, Jim, how you're flying ahead of all of us here. But I just want to ask you something. Jim and I have realized that he in Chicago, me in Boston, we both grew up in the 50s, should we say, 40s, 50s, in the medieval church, and the sort of the Irish Catholic Counter-Reformation church. It's a long time ago. But I just ask you to sort of remind us, where is orthodoxy? Where is the curia in your picture of this, should we say, you know, very decentralized and spirited thing?
Well,
if you get me.
Sure, I do. I'm orthodoxy, right belief. It's important that we check what we believe against the standard of the community. That's why we're in community. And so the creed is an important check on our belief. But of course, we immediately have to get into the act of interpretation, understanding, and when we test our belief, not only against the creed, but against the magisterium of the church, the teaching authority of the church, we know now, post-Vatican II, that checking has the character more of a conversation and a consultation than it does the seeking of permission. So I don't seek permission in checking what I believe. I submit what I believe to the discussion that the community conducts with itself. And every community has the necessity of setting boundaries. Benedict has emphasized the boundaries, but there's also a way in which the porous character of the boundaries needs to be claimed too. I'm conscious that when, after the destruction of the temple, the Jesus people and the rabbis developed their separate responses to the loss of the center of Jewish identity, that the Jesus people developed a notion of centered orthodoxy, and the rabbis, as I understand it, speaking from outside, developed a sense of orthopraxy. It's right action, right behavior, right conduct, observance of the law, halakha, that defines us. It's right belief that defines us, which is why you can be excommunicated for the wrong belief, but you can't be excommunicated if you're Hitler. because Hitler didn't expressly deny Catholic doctrine. Well, of course, he did all over the place, but that wasn't the issue. If Hitler had, you know, distributed condoms and said that there was no problem with, well, of course, in the middle of the 20th century, birth control wasn't an issue yet, really. But you take my point. We Catholics have to be humble in the ways in which we've lost hold of something by our overemphasis on orthodoxy, and understand, back-checking what we believe against the memory of Jesus, who said, it isn't the one who says, Lord, Lord, who enters the kingdom of heaven. It's the one who does the will, acts of compassionate love, and so on. So we Catholics have some explaining to do, but the joyous experience I've had as a Catholic is it's been going on my entire life with the post-World War II re-examination of what the orthodoxy means. And to return to that one basic principle, there was nothing more orthodox than the supersessionist claim that the church has replaced the synagogue. And that's been repudiated theologically and doctrinally. And that's the kind of template now for all of us Catholics. And the bottom line is you check what you believe, and we learned this from Christopher Stendahl, against its real impact on human beings in the world. And doctrine that is ethically impaired needs to be changed. So ethics has a kind of precedence over theology, if you want. The ethical test. What happens to the neighbor by what I believe? And if what happens to the neighbor is a pogrom, there must be something wrong with what I believe.
Frank, you want to register a thought on orthodoxy, and then we'll go to the phones, as we say.
I think a good Catholic doctrine is original sin. And I think in one way this means just about anything can be good and anything can be spoiled and ruined. And I think doctrine and orthodoxy are no exception. So as Jim was saying, I think having the kind of rule of faith and the measure against which one can test or enter conversation about the things we believe is a good thing. But if doctrine or orthodoxy is turned into a club, if it's turned into merely like a knife for excommunication, it becomes a bad thing. Obviously, as a professor in the Divinity School, I think we can go back and look at the doctrines and say, well, how have they worked and how does the orthodoxy stand? So you could take the creed, you could go through that. But even something as simple as Jesus is truly human and truly divine, I think it is, it's one of the core doctrines of orthodoxy, Christian orthodoxy. And in some ways, it's a incomprehensible statement that has two languages that neither one has succeeded in canceling out the other. So you have to keep saying, Jesus is human, our experience is human, the church is human, we are all human sisters and brothers, and the element of God is always going to be there in this double language. So that's the kind of orthodoxy that I think we'd lose something if we did away with it. But if we turn it into, you didn't say exactly what Chalcedon said, you're in trouble, then it becomes another instance of that sinfulness that we all suffer.
Please, I'm daunted by the learning and the experience and the commitment. It's so thick on the ground here. I don't know exactly where to begin, but let's keep questions short. We'll try to keep answers short. I know we could go all night, but let's plunge.
Is there a possibility? Can you wait for the mic, please? Over 40 years ago, Karl Rahner spoke in Cambridge, and he thought that that at Vatican II, that the Church was going to enter into a new epoch, the epoch of the world Church. 40 some odd years later, are we entering into a new epoch of the Catholic Church becoming a world church?
You're elected, Frank.
Were you there? I was there that day when he gave that talk. So it was over in the church on Garden Street, right near Episcopal Divinity School and Weston Jesuit School. And I remember that Rahner got up, and we're all kind of in awe of Rahner getting up. And to our horror and shock, he starts speaking in German. And there's no world church then. So then after about 2 sentences, he sat down, and Leo Donovan, who was on the faculty then at Western, later Georgetown president and so on, got up and gave the talk in English. And then Rana shook our hands afterwards. It was a very charming occasion. But the idea was that, the third church, the original Jerusalem church, the European church, and now we're on the verge of a world church in which we're no longer kind of saying there's Europe plus everything else, but that this new dawning consciousness, partly you could say the demographics. So Rana could see that where are the Catholics' populations growing. That was part of it. And as I said before, we all know that the largest number are below the equator. The second thing I think was praying for a diversity of leadership in the church. And maybe with Francis we begin to have a signal of that, at least a step outside the European context for the first time in a very long time. But the idea that now we have it advanced so that all the bishops in India are Indians, all the bishops I believe all the bishops in Latin America and Africa are of those cultures. That's a big change from 40, 50 years ago. But I think Rana was also, as a great scholar, kind of intellectually looking, how can we break out of the standard modes of Western Christianity conceived according to the languages and choices of Western European history? And I think we're still on the edge of trying to do that. So as Kevin was saying in his introduction, documents like Dominus Jesus in 2000 don't really show the openness that one expects in the world in which we live today. And I think while Rana could only be like Moses at the edge of the promised land, pointing to something that he could not live long enough to experience, that it was opening the door. I was just on the editorial board for just now finished Christianity in Asia volume that Oxford University Press is publishing. And the incredible diversity of Asia, from Israel, Palestine in the west over to Japan and north and south, the incredible diversity of the Christian voices of Asia, no longer saying, well, the church is what we know in Rome and France and England and North America, and then let's have a chapter on the rest. No, it's disproportionately open now. And I'd like to think that over this century, what Rana was prophesying is coming true, whether or not we like it. And I think the thing about any of us who have any leadership roles in the church, including the Pope, is can we go with this and find God's grace in it, because it's going to happen anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I'm here from the medical school. It seems like it wasn't that long ago when there was tremendous enmity towards the Jesuits within the Catholic Church. And I wondered when the Pope took the name Francis if he was just trying to bury the hatchet, since Pope Clement banned the Jesuits on the eve of the American Revolution. He was a Franciscan.
But he didn't take the Jesuit Francis name, right?
Oh, but St. Francis Assisi, and the Franciscans, there was a Franciscan who banned the Jesuits in 1773. So maybe he's telling the world, no, I'm not going to go after the Franciscans. But I just wonder if, here's a guy, what does it mean to have a Jesuit now in the church? Is there a new tolerance within the church towards the Jesuit ethos? Is this a way of reacting to this anti-intellectualism, I think, that's been out there in the conservative circles? And here is a guy who had science training. He's the first pope with any scientific training in more than 1,000 years. So I just am interested to know what you think of that.
While you're up, Frank, redefine or define for us the Jesuit ethos.
You want to answer this? All right, let me say something, and then I'll let Jim say something, because I don't think Jesuits should be the only ones to talk about Jesuit things. But so what is the Jesuit thing about? So it's the the greater glory of God, the magis, the more, finding God in all things, the ability again to imagine the borderlands, to step outside, to be church where there is no church, to go to the farthest parts of the world, to learn the languages, to be in the different cultural settings, to be in all the difficult places. All of these things can be said. The essence of it, where the life source is for Jesuits, is that the spiritual exercise of Ignatius Loyola, which was based in his own mystical experience, is not a book of doctrine. It's not a book, it's not a catechism. It's not a book that you can sit down and read and say, okay, I have learned. but it's something like I'm teaching a course now on the Yoga Sutras. It's a book of exercises, spiritual exercises, in which one has to put oneself into the situation of existentially confronting your own limitations, your own sickness, your own age, your own death, and then launch into walking with Christ, contemplating Christ, and then see where it comes out the other end. And this brilliant thing that Ignatius has about discernment, and many of you know this, is that it's not where God's will is for you or me is not going to be resolved simply by using our reasoning power. We're simply not going to deduce what is right in God's will. It's not going to be St. Paul being knocked down on the road to Damascus. It will be blindingly clear. It rarely is. But you have to read the movements of your heart, both individuals and the community. You have to look for light and darkness, consolation, desolation, and then give it your best shot. Go out there and see what happens, and try and learn, and then every day look back and say, is it working? Is it working? So all of that, I think, is there. Now, what does it matter that there's a Jesuit Pope and the Jesuit seal is in the middle of his papal seal now? I mean, I'm not against payback time. Next year is the 200th anniversary of the restoration of the society after the suppression. That's probably why Benedict stepped down, so there'd be a Jesuit in place for these celebrations. I'd like to think, I mean, we're sort of proud of our modeled history. And Jesuits have not always been the angels. I mean, we've been on the dark side of a number of controversies over the years, like a lot of anti-Semitism in Jesuit writings and so on. So I don't want to romanticize, but I think the reason we've often gotten in trouble is because, and I think Francis, our Pope, would agree on this, that whether you're liberal or conservative, you can always ask the question. You can always be saying, what is it that we're trying to achieve? What is it that comes next? And if you're asking questions to which you already know the answer, you're wasting your time. And I think that kind of, from his background in chemistry, whatever, the intellectual edge, being unafraid of thinking without knowing the answers, I would like to think that serves us well as what I said at the beginning, the fact that he had to live in, for 40, 50 years in community with other Jesuits will rub a lot of the rough edges off him. But Jim, you
well, I'd like to make a couple of observations. When I was a Catholic priest, I was a Paulist father, and we thought of ourselves as the anti-Jesuits. There were, as you were reminding us, 30,000 or so Jesuits when I was a Paulist priest. There were 300 Paulist fathers. The Jesuits had great universities. The Paulist fathers, by definition, were campus ministers, chaplains at non-Catholic universities where Catholics weren't supposed to be. And there was a certain way in which this tension with the Jesuits was defining for us, but it also meant, of course, for me, that the Jesuits remain at the center of my imagination as a Catholic. And one of the things I love most about my Catholic tradition are the Jesuits. I went to Georgetown before I entered the seminary. The Jesuits have always, for me, embodied the ideal of rational faith, a faith that thinks, and thought that tests itself against belief. That strikes me as the Jesuits have made that real in the life of the Church, for good and for ill. The Jesuits, as I remember it, correct me if I get this wrong, would not accept into membership anyone with Jewish blood, as the expression used to be, within 3 or 4 generations. A regulation that was in effect until after World War II. John Courtney Murray is the great champion of religious liberty, a Jesuit. His nemesis was Father Feeney, a Jesuit. The Jesuits have been the brackets within which the great life of the Church has unfolded. If I have a little nagging note of regret about the Pope being a Jesuit, is that I've always thought it was great for the Church that there was a power center outside the non-religious order hierarchy. Traditionally the monasteries, but very powerfully the Jesuits. And to me, it was always something, there was a virtue in the fact that Jesuits were not bishops and popes. Because it meant that bishops and popes had to understand there was a principle of criticism within the life of the Church to which they had to somehow be held accountable. And I would hate to think that the religious orders would become part of the normal power structure of the church. That would be a loss. And the Jesuits, by far the most powerful religious order, I hope it preserves its independence. Now, there's a tension there, too, because the Jesuits have traditionally, as I recall, taken a vow of obedience to the Pope, which I think was probably imposed as part of the disciplining at some point. But nevertheless, that independence of identity has been good for the church. And, but at this moment in history, there's nothing to be regretted. And the fact that he named himself for the heart of the church, coming from the brain of the church, is a good thing.
Can I add just a footnote to that? The famous or infamous fourth vow of the Jesuits of obedience to the Pope is, if you go back and read the language, it's actually a vow to take missions from the Pope to go anywhere in the world on mission. And while it certainly was a counter or a Catholic Reformation sign of loyalty to Rome, it also, in Ignatius's vision, ensured mobility, that the Jesuits could not get bogged down simply under the control of one diocese or one bishop or one king of France or Spain, whatever, but that the Pope could at any point intervene and say, would you leave there and go somewhere else? And the Jesuit could always say, look, Your Eminence, Your Excellency, we're going. We didn't take a vow of stability to be in your school, your diocese. The Pope has asked us to go elsewhere, and we'll go. Sometimes that's worked out intellectually, like when Paul VI gave the mission to the society to think through the issues of atheism. And it was like an intellectual journey, but it was go there where the problems have not been solved and work it out. But it's often been seen as a black or white, absolute obedience to the Pope in all matters, but actually it's more technically about mobility and service.
Please, question.
Mine was also going to be along the lines of the Jesuit Pope. I guess I'm grateful for obviously the Jesuits and spiritual exercises. And I guess my question is, do you see in the ability of Pope Francis to have done the exercises a difference that he might make in the discernment and the actions that he has with the power struggles in the world? So will there be, do you see that some freedom, in decision making? I don't know. Is that
Yes. I mean, I would say, again, one would hope that this would be the case. One can never predict what happens in any particular case. When one is in a position of authority, sometimes you're not free or you're afraid and you back off and so on like that. And I don't want to make an unfair comparison like, the previous popes have been prisoners of politics and the Jesuit Pope will be free or something. So putting all that aside, what I'd like to think is that again, what I said about the point of the exercises is you're putting yourself in a position of radical freedom. You're putting yourself in a position where the will of God cannot be determined merely by reason or miracles or authority. And you have to keep going back and saying, is it working? Is there light here? Is there peace here? Is this where Jesus would be? And I would like to think that if one has the momentary, overwhelming charism to be the Bishop of Rome, and in this leadership position, that would be the position, the question that the Pope would be putting to the Church. Not how do we preserve or protect ourselves after 2,000 years, not how do we have more vocations, not how do we control this or that, but are we where we should be? And the sense that he seemed to have had some of this language in documents he wrote in Argentina and with the Latin American bishops, we have to break out of our stereotypical modes, our clericalism, because God is out there, God is among the people, and the trouble is that's uncharted territory, but we have to go there. And I'd like to think that the exercises and this kind of, it's not so much being the most brainy people in the church, but this kind of intellectual edge, like put aside everything else and just go there and see what happens, would be a brilliant thing if he could pull it off as head of the church, but people have to have lowered expectations about how one person in Rome could do that. But if he can set the tone by saying, don't be afraid of ambiguity, then that would be a great service. And I think that would be a Jesuit thing.
Who's ready? Please.
Just one comment and then I have a question. I have a comment and a question. A friend of mine who's a Jesuit priest. He defined to me as a Jesuit as a soldiers of the Catholic Church. Okay, you can explain to me, well, what the soldiers does for the church. My question is, the 60% of Catholic population in the United States, they are for the safe sex practices and condom use and pro-abortion. And it sounds to me this is an irresistible force of public opinion, counter to the immovable object of the Church of Catholicism. Where do you think it's going to end up?
That's obviously for you, Jim.
Well, I spoke earlier about the movement of history. Contraception began as the single most important instance of and token of the equality of women. Once women could have autonomy in relationship to their own reproductive lives, they were prepared to have political, social, economic autonomy and equality. And the opposition to contraceptives in the Catholic Church is related to this frightened rejection of feminism. And as I said before, the Roman Catholic Church is not going to be the only institution on the planet to successfully wall off the feminist revolution. It's not going to happen. And sexual morality has been the wall with which the Church has surrounded itself on this, the magisterial Church at any rate, and it's been profoundly dishonest. It's not true that contraception is against Catholic teaching. Catholic teaching on contraception only goes back to the early 20th century. There wasn't any such thing as reliable, meaningful contraception anywhere before the 18th century into the 19th century. Thomas Aquinas believed that ensoulment took place at birth and therefore was opposed to baptizing fetuses or miscarried children. The Catholic Church has no long-standing tradition on contraception. This is a myth, and it's infuriating, and it's dishonest. And when the administration of Boston College, a Jesuit institution, makes an issue with Boston College students of contraception, it's embarrassing, but more than that, it's a scandal, because it's inviting the continuation of the structure of deceit, in Gary Will's phrase, that has been a cancer on the Catholic Church. And the bishops pretend to enforce the rule against contraception. Catholic people pretend to listen to it. Everybody knows it's pretending. It's dishonest. It's lying. And this is an example of what the Pope has to deal with.
Can I just add a bit of a comment? I mean, I think...
No, Father gave me the obligation to answer the question. You remember that, right?
What would one do if one was Pope? I think probably anyone who becomes Pope realizes they are no longer the master of their own lives, and that there's incredible institutional pressure to maintain certain things, probably almost impossible to say certain things out loud anymore, and so on. And I would think that it would not be inconceivable to me that in his heart of hearts, Francis would say exactly what Jim said about contraception, would say, of course, we should have women priests. Women are called to ordination. This is an obvious thing. But as Pope, he's not in a position where he can say these things. The few samples that we have of how he acted as Archbishop in Argentina, apparently one was very powerful, where in a letter, I'm not sure if a letter or some kind of a statement, excoriated priests who were refusing to baptize the children of unmarried women, and saying, well, this is not proper, these women are not really Catholic, they're in sin, and so on. And he told them, have you no heart? Have you no good sense? Have you no compassion? And of course you baptize them. Of course you cross that boundary. So that instinct, and he's been criticized by some conservative bloggers and all that, when Argentina was dealing with the issues of civil unions and same-sex marriage, not speaking out vigorously about the issue against it. And I gather in certain conversations among the bishops, he said, It will not be the end of the church if there are civil unions and same-sex marriages. That is not the teaching of the church, but that is the society in which we will be living. We can still be church in that society. So some kind of instincts at least, okay, you're Pope, there are limits to what you can say or do, but nonetheless the imagination that you don't have to be a fanatic about it, you don't have to be a totalitarian about reasserting your authority, but live in the ambiguity of saying society is doing things and living things, values that we have very hard time right at the moment of recognizing. And Francis perhaps is the kind of person who can say, okay, get used to it and let's move on.
I would just add one footnote to that subject, which is there is, of course, an elephant in the room around this whole issue, which is the priestly sex abuse crisis, which we haven't referred to. And the Catholic Church is, in some large moral way, defined by that problem right now. It has yet to find a way fully and authentically to respond to it. And that's related to this issue.
I share what I think is your enthusiasm at this moment for the future, more than I have since I studied with the Jesuits in Rome 40 years ago, after Harvard Divinity School. And, but because I studied in Rome, I also wonder about pushback and shadows. And I think we've started to see a little discussion about that, but I wondered if anyone cared to talk a little bit about the future of the Roman Catholic Communion in terms of what issues of that kind there may be. I'm leaving it kind of open.
I mean, I would say, let me say something and Jim could speak. And perhaps you can rephrase, push the question further if we're not getting it. I think the pushback has already started. And again, some of the conservative blogs one reads, people incredibly concerned about the violations of the current Pope and the current Pope not being faithful to tradition. And I'm sure that in any institutional setup, in the Curia, people are realigning themselves around him. There are all kinds of instincts, both of doing good for the church, but also of self-preservation. I mean, you think what happens when somebody becomes president in this country. So Barack Obama, in a sense, finding the impotence of office at a certain point, the pushback from established interests that do not want things to change, and you can't do much about it. I would think the real pushback will be not in taking the name Francis of Assisi, who will object to that, not in small gestures like not wearing all the fancy vestments, but if he radically pursues like the sacramental symbolism of washing the feet of the prisoners, and radically pursues the element that the church will be judged and tested by where it is with respect to the poor of the world, and not by the wealth of the Vatican, and not by the well-being of the cardinals, and not by the numbers of people in churches on Sunday. The more he pushes these elements, and the more he doesn't take the role of chief theologian, judging the writings of individual theologians, the more he's saying, get out there in the street, actually do something, as Jim was saying, as Kevin was saying, I think, you're judged by what you do. All the forces will be pushing back, and not simply, malign individuals who are wicked or something like that, or people who are mean-spirited, but just the way, my understanding, the way life works is that power wants to maintain itself, and if you come in and want to change things, power will try to undo you. And he has a very short period of time. I mean, his honeymoon, he's an older man. To be able to sacramentally change the dynamic in the church, not defeat all the forces of evil, but open the door, as John the 23rd did, to real change that is unanticipated and goes in directions we don't know.
Please, Bill. The microphone first.
Just on the question of names, I would like for you to reflect a little bit on the symbolism of the names that are chosen and the meaning of the name as a criterion for the papacy. For example, Ratzinger chose Benedict, Pacelli chose Pius, and then you can look at the other names that were chosen. But it's an extraordinary thing, it seems to me, when a pope chooses a name. And Bergoglio has chosen Francis, and there have been a number of references already to the extraordinary meaning of that choice. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the choice of prior popes' names in relation to the choice of Francis I. This is really a remarkable event for us to think about. And the words that have been spoken about the meaning of that term already and the actions that we have witnessed are an extraordinary development for us in terms of present and future. Thank you.
Well, the sign of sacramental genius is when the sign is a perfect representation of that which is being signified, which is why in the Jewish and Christian tradition, bread and wine are such eloquent symbols of the holy. You don't have to be told anything when someone tells you that the Holy One comes to us as bread and wine. The astonishing choice of this name is, there's a ringing clarity to it that took the world's breath away. It was ingenious. It was worthy of a great poet, the choice of that name. Because Francis, look at who Francis is. He isn't just the man of the poor. He's also the green saint. In October now, beginning at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine about 30 years ago, and the Episcopal tradition has picked this up more than others, but not just there. There are festivals of St. Francis that are celebrations of Gaia, of Holy Earth, where people bring all the animals into the church and all the plants. It's a magnificent tradition. It's St. Francis. St. Francis is the saint of the environmental movement. St. Francis is a secular saint. People who've long since given up any impulse to religious expression have St. Francis in their gardens. And St. Francis belongs to the world. This man choosing that name conveyed something non-verbally, non-rationally, pre-rationally, that you all, I suspect it's implied in your question, I think we felt it, but it was also, it just rang, which in itself is so hopeful. Benedict, sadly, it would have been wonderful if Benedict XV had been evoking the memory of Benedict XIV, who was the pacifist pope, one of the few sane voices on the continent of Europe in 1913, 1914, pleading against the coming war, and then denouncing it when it began, and dismissed by everyone in Europe, in America really. Catholics didn't hear his pleas any more than anyone else did. But Benedict chose Benedict, but we know from his own testimony, because Benedict, as he imagined it, was the patron saint of Europe, and his agenda was to reclaim Europe for the church. Although his predecessor, Benedict, got John Paul II to name Benedict the patron saint of Europe. It had only been done in the pontificate of John Paul II, but John Paul II added two others thinking of Eastern Europe, St. Cyril and St. Methodius. But you're absolutely right to draw our attention to the genius of this name.
I mean, we'd have to ask Professor Madigan to come back to the podium to give us an explanation of papal names. But I think, you can see some of them are obvious. So insisting on continuity, insisting on the church unchanging, Pius IX, Pius X, Pius XI, Pius XII, insisting on the continuity. I'm not sure why John chose John the 23rd. John Paul I, John Paul II, trying to bridge the gap, bringing unity to the church. Jim has already mentioned Benedict wanting to retrieve the tradition of Benedict, who in a sense helped through his monastic movement make Europe Christian. I would like to think that Francis maybe took on also a symbolic meaning, that this Francis is also one of the most Jesus-centered of all saints. I mean, he had the stigmata. He was transformed. He wanted nothing but literally to be the servant of Jesus, having nothing, nowhere to lay his head, living in absolute poverty, radical Jesus orientation, and was the one, as Jim said, who became the universal saint to whom all people in all cultures can look. And this is not an imperial Jesus. This is not Jesus Victor. This is not Jesus who's coming with the armies. This is not Jesus of the great theologians. But this is the Jesus who's utterly poor, bereft, nothing, and therefore speaks to everyone. And if he can somehow evoke that and say, a church that is nothing is a better church, more likely to be a church for everyone, that's a better thing then.
Please.
Also, Francis, as in relation to Islam.
Yeah. Yeah.
Say more, Susan. Say more, Susan.
I just
Yeah.
wanted to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ask the question on mic and explain a little bit about that love.
This really was just intended as a footnote to the reasons why it was appropriate to be Francis. But Francis, the story of Francis going to the Middle East and meeting with the Sultan and they're becoming friends.
Yeah. Yeah.
At the time of the Crusades,
Yeah.
it was a wonderful story, and I think that adds to the symbolic value of the name considerably.
Yeah. No, it's a beautiful thing to evoke that he knew he could not change the mentality, the crusades, the trajectory, the money, the power, the conflict, and all that, but sort of risked himself incredibly by somehow going to talk to the Sultan, perhaps to bring him to Christ, but nonetheless came in such a way that they could have this conversation and then he could be sent home safely. That witness to Islam of honest conversation. And he's already spoken to this effect, like I think on Easter, in fact, we need to be open to and pray with our Muslim sisters and brothers. This maybe some of that echoing there.
I may add this footnote to it. One of the most dramatic and moving moments in all of music is in the Maison's oratorio, St. Francis, when St. Francis kisses the leper.
Could I just sneak in a quick question of my own? What does the Church mean to say, want to say, Pope Francis, specifically to the Islamic world, and maybe the Arab Islamic world in particular, in a state of tremendous transition and turmoil on its own, but you speak of the Crusades and otherwise, also in a period of feeling enormous confrontation with the West, with Europe and the United States?
Well, I wouldn't presume to actually try to answer that, Chris. But I do have a thought, which is it's good news that his roots in Argentina, even though his parents were immigrants, so has shallow roots in Argentina, but nevertheless, roots in Argentina, again at this level of symbol, or let's call it sacrament, a real end to the European, the exclusively European sense of the Church itself. And so the whole post-colonial world, I would hope, could recognize something in this man, in his roots, and in what the electing cardinals chose to say about the Church at that moment. There was a charismatic quality to the election of the Polish Pope at the worst moment of the Cold War. And it turned out to have a tremendous importance for the world, because Wojtyła had the courage and wisdom and insight to use his power for the sake of peace and reconciliation, and as we all know, made a tremendously important intervention on behalf of solidarity against the Polish dictatorship and against the power of the Soviet tyranny. In this moment when the arrival of the post-colonial world, the Arab Spring is a magnificent demonstration of it for all of its unresolved qualities, and you could speak to that. What could be better than for the Church to turn its face in an authentic way toward those lands whose relationship to Europe has almost always been wholly defined by oppression and if not oppression, condescension. So to have a man from the colonial realm as the leader of the Catholic Church, again, it has resonance for us.
I would add just a couple of comments. I mean, one would be, again, I'm very glad that I'm not Pope, because it's such a headache, the whole job. And one thing any Pope would have to worry about is the safety of Christians who are minorities in countries where they seem to be in danger. So we, without stereotyping, we read stories about churches being attacked in Iraq, let's say, or other Coptic Christians in Egypt and so on, sometimes being subjected to violence and so on. And this is no laughing matter. This is something a Pope has to be concerned about. And building up, therefore, political relationships with the powers of the world to protect minorities in different places. I would like to think that, though, on two other levels, this Pope could open the door. One is, first of all, rethinking. I mean, Benedict was concerned about Europe. Well, rethinking and opening the door to a positive attitude toward the presence of Islam in European countries. And so kind of arguing that the Church, as with Francis, will be welcomers, hosts, friends to Muslim minority populations in France and other European countries, Germany and so on. That this is not this third column that's come in to destroy us or something, but we have to be hosts to the alien, the stranger. We have to welcome these people in. That's how we are Christian. Also, the global thing, I'd love to have the Pope go to Indonesia. I'd love the Pope to go and speak to the largest Muslim population in the world and say, we have an openness to our brothers and sisters Muslim everywhere in the world. What he probably won't do, and probably it's the job of the theologians, is to actually study Islam and to go in deeper into Muslim traditions. Just one example, recently had a student presentation here, an excellent presentation, on the Ismaili Muslim interpretation of Jesus, and how the figure of Jesus has been incredibly important for that tradition of Islam. So rather than an oppositional thing, Christians over here, Muslims over there, how already there's a lot to talk about when you realize that for 1,500 plus years there has been a back and forth. At least to have a Pope who can say that kind of study, seeing where it leads, learning the hidden resources, is intellectually part of the credibility of the Church, is also about Islam and Catholicism.
Question over here, and then over here.
Well, I guess my question is, I was really touched, but like many people were, I think, on the Pope's gesture on Holy Thursday of the washing of the feet, especially of the young Muslim woman who he washed. But something that I've also noticed is that the poorest in the world, especially in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, even in the United States, usually tend to be women and children. And the issue really is how does the Church reconcile their commitment to the poor in the 21st century when these places that have the most Catholics also tend to have post-colonial hierarchies that are very male dominant at the same time. So how does the Church and the leadership of the Pope, who I have read certain articles by him that are not so fond of female in leadership positions, how do we find a role for standing up for the poor, and especially within that perspective, standing up for women and children in that kind of poverty?
Well, it is important to remember this man rose to power successfully meeting the demands of a tremendously patriarchal, chauvinist institution. So that's the starting point. And you draw our attention to the well-known fact that you can measure the any culture's progress against poverty by measuring the status of women in that culture. And if this Pope is devoted to the poor, is it only an abstraction? Because this is where those issues we touched upon before, they're not just upper middle class European and American issues about contraception, population control, full equality for women. These issues have life and death consequences, not just for HIV, but for those women and children you're reminding us of. Life and death consequences are at issue with the equality of women. So we're not just talking about the kind of woman who goes to HDS and wants to be ordained. That's not really where it most matters. It matters the fate of millions of people and their health and their longevity that depend on the equality of women. And so the Catholic Church cannot be theoretically committed to eliminating poverty or theoretically committed to the equality of women without actually dismantling its own structures of chauvinist discrimination against women. The question is this Pope capable of reckoning with that historical given? That's the question. And in 5 or 6 or 7 years, he won't do much, but he could do something. He could do something. Benedict did a lot to reinforce the walls against change at that level. This, you know, as Frank reminds us, this man can only do so much. But on the other hand, this is the last command society on the planet, even more than China at this point. The leader of China has less executive power than the Pope does. He could be, and of course, if he exercised it in the way I would like to see him do it, he would be the last command Pope, too. Because he would surrender the power to a more democratic structure. But he actually can do a lot. And we saw that, we've seen it once before in John the 23rd, who, recall, in calling the council, was doing something that was never supposed to happen again. Because after the First Vatican Council defined the infallibility of the Pope as the teaching authority supreme in the Church, there was actually no further need of the teaching authority of councils. The old tension between the papacy and the councils was resolved at Vatican I. So the most radical thing that John the 23rd did was call a council. And so this Pope can, I wouldn't necessarily presume to say that would be the thing for him to do, but he can do a lot. And you've just put on the table, front and center, the most important historical fact. And he's not blind to it, obviously.
Just to add a quick comment, and thank you for that question, which is so important. In 1995, the Jesuit General Congregation had a very powerful document of solidarity with women. Justice is justice for women. The gender issues are not to be excluded from the conversation. And this whole odd situation in which we are is now there's a Jesuit Pope, not simply the Jesuit questioner or critic on the side. Will this Pope remember that document and his embracing it as a Jesuit and realizing you can't leave it aside when you go into the Vatican? And I just echo, I mean, Jim has been very eloquent, that there can't be justice for women outside the Church unless there's justice for women inside the Church as well.
We're almost on the witching hour, although for me, I mean, we could go on forever, and it's just getting warm. But I'll ask Kevin Madigan or higher authorities when we should stop, but surely there's room for a question or two more, please.
Some 40 years ago, Leonard Bernstein debuted the Mass as a way of inaugurating the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. And as you'll recall, the Mass begins with a simple song. It's called a simple song. It's one man walking on the stage singing a simple song, and others begin to join him. Inside of 40 minutes, those others become an enormous, complicated, brilliantly lit church. And in the last part of the Mass, this one man walks off to the side of the stage, again by himself, realizing that his initial vision has been quashed. There's a sense in which I think this Pope is very similar to this one man. And one wonders whether there isn't in him necessarily a kind of anti-churchness in order to avoid an anti-Christness.
I mean, I would think that this has to be This is a tension essential to Christianity, but probably to Hinduism, Buddhism, and other traditions as well, that the faith is preached, the witness is given, the love is testified, the justice is done, only if there is an individual who her own voice or his own voice can be heard out there. And then immediately then, all good people join in and it becomes very complicated and impossible fairly quickly. But I would like to think that in that situation, it doesn't end with a sign of defeat on the side, but it begins again. Somebody else picks up the cry, somebody else sings the song, and it begins over again. I mean, we just celebrated in the Christian churches Good Friday, Easter Sunday, and the sense that the total defeat of Jesus, who was abandoned by everyone, then became the opening to these women who came to the tomb and the witness and the growing of his message. I would like to think that, I mean, it's a very Hindu idea. Every ending is a beginning. There is no absolute starting point. There is no absolute ending point. But the simple song continues. Even when some give up, somebody else will sing it.
One more question, please, on this side.
What useful question, in a good spirit, might be asked about the Pope's conduct in Argentina during the Dirty War?
Jim?
Well, I look forward to the long, thorough journalistic investigation of that history. No, seriously, I think it would be interesting. Although the first signals that we have are that from Jesuits and others, there's been some actually superb writing about this already, are that some of the slanders hurled at him are not true, and that he did not, from the account of one of the Jesuit victims himself, betray the Jesuits involved in that first charge, although I don't know the details of it. But that's an important and compelling note. Maybe, Frank, I assume the Jesuits have unpacked some of this in the common rooms. But let me just go back to a more basic point and link it to the idea of the simple or pure church. I love the Bernstein Mass. I actually saw it at the Kennedy Center. But there was something very wrong about it, which was this fantasy of Christianity as pure and the Jesus figure as untouched by the corruptions of the world. And that's what we're looking for, a figure untouched by the corruptions of the world. God forbid he should have been corrupted by the junta, which came out as the kind of first check on our enthusiasm. Well, juntas corrupt everybody in the societies over which they exercise power. That's the nature of a tyrannical dictatorship, because people, to survive, begin to behave in ways that they wouldn't otherwise behave. The only people you can be sure were pure during the time of the junta in Argentina are dead. Everyone who survives in a situation like that, maybe not everyone, but most, and people in positions of responsibility like the Archbishop, have to make accommodations. And I would be very slow to get on a moral high horse about what those accommodations required. Having said that, I'll just let my last note be this one, which is Jesus didn't come to the pure and the sinless. And the church he established isn't, or the church that was established in memory of him, was never understood or could never be understood as pure and sinless. That's the point of the incarnation, coming to be with human beings as we are. And the Puritan impulse is the one that wants us to define ourselves as the pure society. And then we become ashamed of our impurity, and we become liars about it. And when Pope Leo XIII defined the Catholic Church as the perfect society, you knew there was a problem somewhere. And then when you have to pretend to be perfect, then the next thing you know, you have to protect abusive priests and all that follows from that. And the good news for Pope Francis, the best thing that's going for him, unlike all of his predecessors, is nobody in the whole world now thinks the Catholic Church is the perfect society. Its foibles and failures and sins are available and clear to everybody. And I would suspect that most people who lived in Buenos Aires in those days, you don't hear a lot of noise from there about the corruptions of this man and his time there. So that would be my general perspective on it. The good news is that God comes to us as we are. I know that at the Harvard Divinity School, you all don't need to think that way, but the rest of us do.
I would just add that I think it would be wonderful if Francis showed us that living in that ambiguous situation, having power at a very difficult time, he learned from it. He's not afraid to talk about it. He's able to kind of share the experience with the world church about how he lived in those gray areas where power was abused. And then also realize it could happen again. As the head of the church, this could happen again, not out of malice, but out of being sucked into protective strategies and all that. If he realized what happened then, which was awkward, not a big crime it sounds like, but awkward around the edges, that being in Rome doesn't mean that you're in a simpler place, but that he could now do this on a global scale, or confess it and say, we're all sinners.
Kevin. Well, I'd like to thank all of you, first of all, for your deep and searching questions, and would you please join me in thanking Paul Massari, first of all, and for our three panelists for their generosity tonight.